London, April 1847. The rain tapped restlessly against the windows of the Hartwell townhouse, as if echoing the unrest inside the study where Isabella Hartwell sat, her heart racing in quiet rebellion. At 22, she had once dreamed of love, of a marriage born of tenderness and choice, but all such fantasies had been buried beneath the weight of her family's ruin. Before her lay the document that would alter her life forever. The candlelight quivered across the parchment as the solicitor cleared his throat. "You understand the terms, Miss Hartwell?" His voice was brisk, but there was an undertone of pity. Isabella raised her golden head, blue eyes shining not with hope, but with resignation tempered by a surprising strength. "I do, Mr. Holloway. The agreement is clear." Across from her, Lord Henry Hartwell, once a man of commanding presence and political influence, avoided her gaze. He was a shadow of himself now, his shoulders hunched, his eyes bloodshot with sleepless worry. Years of reckless investments, compounded by gambling losses and mortgages piled one upon another, had hollowed his fortune and nearly destroyed the family name. Creditors circled like wolves, whispers of disgrace seeped through every drawing-room in London. Without intervention, the Hartwell legacy would collapse, dragging her younger sisters with it into a future without prospects, without dowries, without hope. And so Isabella had consented to this sacrifice, not for her father's sake alone, but for Clara and for the younger girls who depended on her. The heavy door to the study opened, without warning, carrying with it a sudden shift in atmosphere. A tall figure entered, moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Adrian Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Ravenscroft, filled the room with his presence before a word had been spoken. At 35, his reputation preceded him. Wealthy, powerful, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. His sharply cut features carried the elegance of high breeding, but his expression was carved in ice. He removed his gloves with precision, his grey eyes sweeping across the room until they landed on Isabella, assessing her as one might a valuable acquisition. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth, "I trust the arrangements meet with your approval." Isabella rose to meet him, spine stiff, though her pulse quickened. "They do, Your Grace." She would not cower. "Excellent." He moved to the desk, his gloved hands brushing aside ledgers and documents as though they were of no consequence. The solicitor offered him a pen, which Adrian accepted without hesitation. His signature sprawled boldly across the parchment, an elegant flourish that sealed the contract of their lives. Then, with the smallest tilt of his head, he extended the pen toward Isabella. For the briefest instant, their fingers touched, a fleeting brush of warmth against her skin that she forced herself to ignore. Taking the pen, she scrawled her name beneath his with careful dignity. Isabella Hartwell. Adrian Blackwood. Two names now bound together in a union that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with survival. "The wedding will take place 3 weeks from today," Adrian announced, addressing Lord Henry rather than Isabella. "St. George's, Hanover Square. The announcement will appear in tomorrow's papers." Lord Henry nodded fervently, his voice breaking. "Your generosity honours us, Your Grace. You have saved us." The Duke's response was cool, measured. "It is a mutually beneficial arrangement." Then at last, his gaze returned to Isabella. "I will send for you tomorrow afternoon. There are matters regarding your future duties as Duchess of Ravenscroft that require discussion." She swallowed the sharp retort rising in her throat, forcing composure. "Of course, Your Grace." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but a fleeting curve that suggested he found her defiance curious. "Until tomorrow, then." With a bow to her father and the faintest nod to her, he departed as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving behind a lingering trace of sandalwood and the oppressive weight of inevitability. When the door closed, Lord Henry slumped into his chair, his face lined with relief. "It is done," he whispered. "We are saved." Isabella turned to the rain-darkened window, her reflection faint against the glass, her new reality pressing down upon her shoulders. "Yes," she answered softly, her voice trembling with something that was not quite triumph. But at what cost? The following afternoon, Isabella found herself stepping into the grand entrance hall of Ravenscroft House, Adrian Blackwood's London residence. If the Hartwell townhouse whispered of faded dignity and financial decay, this house spoke in bold, unrelenting tones of wealth and authority. Gleaming marble stretched beneath her slippers, echoing with each step as a butler, Phillips, she later learned, announced her presence with rigid precision. She was guided through long corridors adorned with ancestral portraits and priceless canvases, until at last she was ushered into a study that seemed the very embodiment of its master. Dark oak panelling, towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, and a massive desk stationed before tall windows overlooking manicured gardens. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her, his posture as commanding as when she had first met him. "Leave us, Phillips," he ordered without turning. The butler bowed and withdrew, the door closing heavily behind him. Silence thickened, broken only when Adrian spoke again. "Please, sit." His voice carried no warmth, but its authority allowed no hesitation. Isabella obeyed, arranging her skirts carefully, determined not to betray the nervous flutter in her chest. He turned then, his storm-grey eyes fixed on her as he crossed the room with deliberate slowness. "Tea?" he asked, an unexpected courtesy. She inclined her head, uncertain. To her surprise, he poured it himself from a silver service, rather than summoning a servant. When he handed her the delicate cup, their fingers brushed again, a spark that unsettled her more than she wished to admit. Adrian took his seat opposite, his gaze steady, unreadable. "We should establish certain understandings before our wedding, Miss Hartwell." Isabella lifted her chin. "I agree, Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected, his tone cool but firm. "If we are to be husband and wife, you may call me by my given name, at least in private." His choice startled her, but she matched it with equal resolve. "Then you must call me Isabella." For a fleeting second something shifted in his expression. Approval, perhaps, before the mask of detachment returned. "Very well, Isabella. Our arrangement," he continued, "is one of necessity, not romance. I require a duchess. I require heirs. Your family requires financial salvation. These terms are clear." His bluntness, though jarring, was oddly refreshing compared to the veiled courtesies of polite society. Isabella sipped her tea, her voice even. "I appreciate your directness, Adrian." He inclined his head slightly. "I have no patience for illusions. After the wedding, you will assume all duties of the Duchess of Ravenscroft. You will manage the households, oversee the staff, attend and host social gatherings. In time, you will bear children to continue the line." His matter-of-fact mention of children sent warmth to her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And what of your duties to me?" she asked, her tone edged with quiet steel. He blinked, faintly surprised. "Explain." "If I am to fulfill my obligations, I expect you to fulfill yours. I will not be treated as a mere acquisition, Adrian. I may have entered this marriage out of necessity, but I will not accept humiliation." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. His eyes searched hers as though testing her limits. Then unexpectedly he inclined his head. "Fair enough. You shall have my name, my protection, my respect, and my fidelity. Your sisters will receive dowries, your father's debts will be erased. You and any children we may have will never want for anything." His expression hardened, though not cruelly. "What I cannot give is romantic attachment. My first marriage cured me of such illusions." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Isabella had heard whispers, of course, rumours of his disastrous first marriage to Lady Caroline Somerset, of betrayal, scandal, and a tragic accident. Yet, hearing him speak of it so coldly lent the whisper's weight. "I do not expect romance, Adrian," Isabella replied quietly, though something within her resisted the starkness of his terms. "But I do hope for respect, and perhaps in time, friendship." His eyes flickered, softer, for the briefest moment before he looked away. "Respect you shall have. Friendship, time will determine." He reached into a cabinet and drew out a small box, setting it on the desk before her. When she opened it, a ring of sapphires and diamonds glimmered in the lamplight, rich and commanding. "This belongs to the Duchess of Ravenscroft," he said. "It will be yours after the ceremony." Isabella traced the edge of the box with a fingertip. "It is beautiful. It is symbolic," he replied. "Once you wear it, you become part of a lineage that stretches back centuries. The Ravenscroft name carries expectations. I trust you understand." "I do." She closed the box with care, her resolve hardening within her. "The dressmakers will arrive tomorrow to begin your trousseau. I've arranged everything." "Efficient," she murmured, searching for the right word. A flicker of amusement touched his lips. "I am nothing if not efficient." For the first time, Isabella saw something more human in him, a spark of wry humor beneath the iron control. But as he escorted her back through the echoing hallways, his voice turned businesslike once more. "After we are married, you will reside primarily at Ravenscroft Abbey in Hampshire. London society can be unkind to new duchesses, particularly those whose marriages are arranged." The implication was clear. He meant to shield her from scandal by removing her from society's stage. Part of her appreciated the consideration, but another part bristled at the thought of being hidden away like a secret. "I am not afraid of London society," she told him quietly. His grey eyes sharpened, unreadable. "Perhaps you should be," he replied. And with that, he handed her into the waiting carriage. As the horses carried her back through the misted streets of London, Isabella pressed her gloved hands together tightly in her lap. She was not naive. She knew her marriage to Adrian Blackwood would be no love story. It was survival, duty, and sacrifice. Yet she could not silence the question that had taken root in her heart since their first meeting. What kind of man lay hidden behind the Duke of Ravenscroft's cold mask? 3 weeks later, London society gathered at St. George's, Hanover Square, to witness the union of Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscroft, and Isabella Hartwell, eldest daughter of a once proud but now financially ruined house. The ceremony was everything expected of such an alliance: solemn grandeur, ivory silks, orange blossoms in her hair, diamonds borrowed from the Hartwell family vault. Isabella walked down the aisle with measured steps, her expression calm, though her heart thundered with conflict. Observers whispered discreetly behind fans and gloves, remarking on the Duke's austere bearing and the bride's quiet dignity. It was no love match, that much was clear, but rather the practical joining of wealth, title, and necessity. When Isabella spoke her vows, she did so with steady voice, binding herself not to affection, but to survival. And when Adrian slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his hand was steady, his expression unreadable, as if the act were no more personal than signing a contract. Yet beneath the solemnity, something unspoken trembled in the air, a tension that neither could name, but both could feel. Afterward, the carriages bore them swiftly away from the clamour of London to Ravenscroft Abbey, Adrian's ancestral seat in Hampshire. The vast estate rose out of the mist with imposing grandeur, its grey stone walls bearing centuries of history. Towers loomed against the stormy spring sky, their windows glimmering faintly in the fading light. For Isabella, the Abbey was a world apart from the Hartwell townhouse, magnificent, alien, intimidating. She stood at the gates, gazing up at its vastness, feeling the weight of the centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. This was to be her home now. She was the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Yet as she passed through the great entrance, lined with servants bowing in rigid respect, She felt like an imposter, wearing borrowed robes. Her first weeks at Ravenscroft Abbey were a careful dance of politeness and restraint. The days unfolded with ritual precision. She and Adrian took breakfast separately, dined together formally in the evening, and retired to separate chambers each night. The marriage remained unconsummated, an omission that both puzzled and relieved her. He treated her with courtesy, never unkind, yet always distant, as though an invisible wall stood between them. In conversation he was precise, economical with words, offering nothing of himself beyond what duty required. And yet, at unexpected moments, she glimpsed cracks in the armour. Once, when she stumbled in the great hall, his hand shot out instantly to steady her, the grip firm, protective, almost tender, before he withdrew with composed indifference. Another evening, when she braved a small joke about his relentless efficiency, she caught the flicker of a genuine smile at the corner of his lips, a fleeting warmth quickly buried beneath composure. These small glimpses unsettled her more than coldness ever could, for they hinted at a man more complex than society's image of the ruthless Duke of Ravenscroft. The abbey itself seemed to test her resolve. Long galleries lined with ancestral portraits reminded her of the generations of Blackwood women who had come before, women born to this life while she had been thrust into it by circumstance. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as she walked, silently questioning whether she was worthy to join their ranks. The household staff, led by Mrs. Henderson, the stern but fair housekeeper, treated her with formal respect but guarded curiosity, as though waiting to see what kind of mistress she would become. Isabella carried herself with quiet determination, refusing to let doubt show. She managed her duties with diligence, consulting Mrs. Henderson, learning the rhythms of the household, listening more than she spoke. Though Adrian rarely commented, she sensed his approval in the absence of criticism. One afternoon, as she walked through the gardens, the scent of early roses mingling with damp earth, a messenger arrived with a sealed invitation. Adrian summoned her to the library, where he stood by the tall windows, the light slanting across his austere features. "We are expected at Lady Winthrop's midsummer ball in 3 weeks," he said. His tone was calm, but Isabella caught the faint tension beneath it. "Lady Winthrop?" she asked. "A significant figure in society," he explained. "Her favour influences many. More importantly, she was my mother's closest friend and has strong opinions regarding my remarriage." Isabella tilted her head, studying him. "She disapproves of me." His gaze sharpened at her perceptiveness. "She has not met you, but she had other candidates in mind for my second wife, her niece, Lady Veronica Sinclair, among them." The name struck a chord. Isabella remembered Lady Veronica from fleeting encounters at society gatherings, celebrated beauty, impeccable lineage, a fortune large enough to make her enviable. "I see," Isabella said carefully. "And was Lady Veronica ever a serious consideration?" Something hardened in Adrian's expression. "No," he replied curtly. The clipped finality of his tone suggested deeper waters, but she knew better than to press further. At the mention of the ball, Isabella felt both excitement and dread. She had been hidden away from London's scrutiny since her marriage, shielded by the Abbey's stone walls. Now she would be paraded before society as the new Duchess, subjected to every glance, every whisper. "What will be expected of me?" she asked. "Everything," Adrian answered plainly. "Your appearance, your manners, your conversation. You will be measured against the standard of every Duchess of Ravenscroft who has preceded you." She lifted her chin. "And if I fall short?" His gaze lingered on her, unwavering. "You won't." The certainty in his voice startled her, warming her in ways she could not admit. "You seem very confident," she said, unable to resist the hint of challenge. His answer was calm, yet carried a weight she could not mistake. "I chose you for a reason, Isabella." She wanted to ask what reason, but the words died on her lips. Something in his eyes warned her that the truth was not yet hers to know. That evening, as she sat alone in her private chamber, Isabella stared out across the rolling fields of Ravenscroft, her thoughts restless. She was a duchess in name, but what did that mean in truth? A wife without intimacy, a partner in duty but not in trust, a symbol in society's eyes but a stranger in her husband's. And yet she remembered his hand steadying her, his faint smile at her jest, his unexpected certainty in her ability to face society's judgment. Perhaps, she thought, the Duke of Ravenscroft was not the man society imagined. Perhaps beneath the cold surface, something else waited to be revealed. But whether that something would be friendship, affection, or simply another layer of calculation, she could not yet know. All she knew was that her future, for better or worse, now rested within these stone walls and within the hands of a man she barely understood. The midsummer evening glowed with opulence as carriages lined the elegant street outside Lady Winthrop's Berkeley Square townhouse. Lanterns cast golden light upon the grand facade, while inside chandeliers sparkled above gilded mirrors and marble floors. Music swelled from the ballroom as the cream of London society assembled in silks and jewels, champagne glasses glittering in their hands. At the top of the sweeping staircase, Isabella stood poised beside Adrian, her hand resting lightly upon his arm. The major domo's voice rang out across the gathered crowd. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, and her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenscroft. A hush fell, followed by the rustle of curiosity as every head turned to watch their descent. Isabella felt the weight of 100 gazes, some warm, many cold, all dissecting her presence. Adrian bent his head close, his breath stirring the curls at her temple. "Remember who you are now," he murmured. The simple words steadied her spine. She was Duchess of Ravenscroft. Whatever the whispers, whatever the truth of their marriage, the title was hers, and she would wear it with dignity. At the foot of the stairs, Lady Winthrop awaited them, regal in plum silk, diamonds glittering at her throat. She greeted Adrian with affectionate familiarity, offering her cheek for his kiss. "Adrian, my dear boy," she said warmly, before turning to Isabella with a cooler smile. "Your Grace." "Welcome." Her curtsy was flawless, yet her tone carried the faintest edge, as though testing Isabella's poise. "You honour me with your hospitality, Lady Winthrop," Isabella replied smoothly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Adrian has spoken of your long friendship with his family." The older woman's eyes flicked between them, assessing. "Indeed, his mother and I were inseparable in our youth." Her emphasis on lineage was deliberate, a reminder that Isabella's family lacked such venerable connections. But Isabella refused to be cowed. "How fortunate for Adrian to have such enduring bonds," she answered evenly. Lady Winthrop's lips thinned almost imperceptibly before she turned to greet another guest. Adrian's voice, low at Isabella's ear, carried the faintest trace of amusement. "Round one? You handled her well?" Isabella allowed herself the smallest smile. "The evening is young." As the night unfolded, Isabella moved through the glittering crowd on Adrian's arm, introduced to peers, ministers, and matrons. She quickly discerned the pattern. Those who relied on the Duke's influence greeted her with obsequious courtesy, while others offered polite curiosity tinged with disdain. Whispers floated in her wake: "Hartwell girl, ruined family, arranged marriage." She kept her head high, speaking with measured grace, refusing to let them see her falter. Yet beneath her calm facade, her heart pounded with the strain of scrutiny. It was during a lull in the introductions, while Adrian spoke with a cabinet minister, that Isabella found herself approached by a striking figure. "Your Grace," came a lilting voice. Isabella turned to face Lady Veronica Sinclair. She was as beautiful as rumour claimed, raven hair gleaming, amber eyes luminous beneath arched brows, her burgundy gown perfectly cut to flatter her form. Diamonds sparkled at her ears and throat, and her smile, though sweet, held the sharpness of a blade. "What a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance," she said. Isabella inclined her head. "Lady Veronica, the pleasure is mine." Veronica's gaze swept over her with deliberate slowness. "I must congratulate you on your marriage. It was quite sudden. Adrian is notoriously selective. We were all astonished when the announcement appeared." Her tone carried honeyed admiration, but her eyes glittered with challenge. Isabella's reply was calm, steady. "Thank you. Life often surprises us." Unperturbed, Veronica tilted her head, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You must find it overwhelming, the title, the responsibilities. The late Duchess set such a formidable standard. Ravenscroft Abbey has not known a mistress for years. I do hope you are equal to the task." Isabella's lips curved in a faint smile. "Every generation brings its own changes. Change, I believe, can be refreshing." Veronica's laugh rang clear and calculated, drawing attention. "How unconventional of you, Duchess. Though in families like the Blackwoods, tradition is sacred, wouldn't you agree?" Her barb hung in the air, a reminder of Isabella's modest background. Isabella met her gaze steadily. "Traditions evolve, Lady Veronica. Otherwise we would still be living in caves." A ripple of suppressed laughter spread among those listening, and a flash of anger crossed Veronica's face before she masked it with another glittering smile. Later, near the ballroom terrace, Isabella was again cornered, this time not by subtle barbs but by open cruelty. Veronica, flanked by a small circle of ladies, addressed her in a voice that carried easily across the gathering. "Your Grace, we were just admiring how swiftly duty can arrange what inclination might never have accomplished. After all, everyone knows the Duke required an heir, and your family required salvation, a perfectly reasonable exchange." Murmurs rippled through the surrounding guests as eyes turned toward Isabella, waiting for her to falter. Her pulse raced, but she kept her chin lifted. "How fortunate, then, that duty and inclination sometimes align," she replied evenly. But Veronica pressed her advantage, her voice rising with cruel precision. "Indeed, though one does wonder, Duchess, how it feels to know you were chosen not for yourself, but as the most convenient vessel for Ravenscroft's heir. A transaction, not a union." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face, the sting of humiliation searing her like fire. Before she could answer, a sudden shift rippled through the assembly. The crowd parted as Adrian strode forward, his expression thunderous, his eyes fixed on Veronica. "Lady Veronica," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you forget yourself." Colour drained from her cheeks, but she attempted a weak smile. "Adrian, I meant only—" "You meant insult," he cut in coldly, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "You will show respect to my wife, the Duchess of Ravenscroft, or you will leave this house immediately." The rebuke, delivered with such authority, left Veronica visibly shaken. Yet it was what followed that silenced the room entirely. Turning to Isabella, Adrian took her face gently in his hands and without hesitation kissed her. Not the chaste brush of lips expected of a formal husband, but a fierce, passionate kiss that declared possession, protection, and something dangerously close to desire. Gasps swept the ballroom. Isabella's knees threatened to give way, her world tilting as the Duke of Ravenscroft, known for his icy reserve, kissed her as though she were the only woman in existence. When at last he drew back, his gaze burned into hers, fierce and unyielding. "Come, my love," he said clearly for all to hear. "We've had enough of this evening's entertainment." In stunned silence, the crowd parted as Adrian led Isabella from the ballroom, his arm protective around her waist. Behind them, whispers erupted like wildfire, and Veronica's triumphant smile twisted into fury. But Isabella scarcely noticed. Her lips still tingled from the force of his kiss, her heart raced with a confusion she could not untangle. Was it strategy, performance, a shield against humiliation? Or had it been something more? The carriage rattled through the darkened streets of London, its lanterns casting shifting shadows across the plush interior. Isabella sat opposite Adrian, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breath still unsteady. The roar of the ball, the whispers, the humiliating sting of Veronica's words, all of it clung to her like smoke. Yet nothing consumed her thoughts more than the kiss. Her lips still tingled from the press of his mouth, a fire that seemed to burn through every inch of her composure. She lifted her gaze to him at last, her voice breaking the tense silence. "Why did you do that?" Her words trembled with confusion and an edge of hurt. "Because it was necessary," Adrian replied, his expression unreadable in the shifting lamplight. "Necessary," she repeated, bitterness creeping into her tone. "To salvage appearances, you mean? To silence their whispers?" His grey eyes fixed on hers, steady and intense. "No, to protect what is mine." The declaration stunned her into silence. Mine. The word was both comforting and terrifying, spoken with such possessive conviction that she hardly knew how to feel. She turned her face toward the window, the London streets blurring past, before whispering, "Lady Veronica was not entirely wrong, was she? Our marriage, it was a transaction." His jaw tightened, his shoulders rigid against the seat. "It began that way," he admitted at last. "But she was wrong about why I chose you." The carriage jolted slightly as it turned onto another street, the horse's hooves striking the cobblestones. Isabella forced herself to meet his gaze again. "Then why did you?" she pressed. "Out of all the women in London, why me? Why the daughter of a ruined family?" Adrian's face was half in shadow, but she could see the strain in his expression, the careful control he wielded like armor. At last he spoke, his voice low. "Because unlike the others, you looked at me, not my title, not my fortune. Me." Isabella blinked, startled. "When we first met at Lady Harrington's musical last winter," he continued, his gaze distant, as if recalling the moment, "you were the only woman in the room who did not scheme or flatter. You spoke your mind about a sonata by Beethoven, your opinion, not an echo of mine. That impressed me." Isabella's heart skipped. She remembered the evening, though she had thought little of their brief exchange. "I had no idea you even noticed me," she murmured. "I noticed," he said firmly. "Afterward I observed you, the way you cared for your sisters, your dignity despite your family's decline, your composure in the face of gossip. When I learned of your father's situation, I saw an opportunity that might serve us both, but even then, I knew I wanted someone with strength of character, not another Caroline." The name fell heavily into the space between them. Isabella had heard whispers of Lady Caroline Somerset, Adrian's first wife, the betrayal, the scandal, the tragic accident. Yet this was the first time he had spoken her name aloud. His voice was controlled, but beneath it she sensed the wound that still lived within him. "I didn't want another woman who married me for my position while harboring resentments and desires elsewhere," he said quietly. "I wanted someone who understood duty, loyalty, someone who would not pretend to feel what she did not." Isabella swallowed, her throat tight. "You make me sound like a horse at auction," she said softly, "chosen for breeding and temperament." For the first time, that night, his eyes flickered with something raw, almost regretful. "That was not my intention. I meant to honor your character, not diminish it." The carriage slowed as it approached Ravenscroft House. For a moment, silence stretched between them, fragile and uncertain. Then, almost hesitantly, Adrian shifted from his seat opposite her to the one beside her. Isabella stiffened as his presence filled the space between them, but when he reached for her hand, his touch was uncharacteristically gentle. "Then let me speak plainly," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What happened tonight, Veronica's cruelty, was my fault. I should have anticipated it. I should have protected you better." Isabella shook her head quickly, though her heart twisted at the uncharacteristic note of self-reproach in his tone. "I don't need protection, Adrian," she insisted, though her voice softened. "Only honesty." He studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to reveal something more. At last he said, "Then honestly, Isabella, I find myself pleased with our arrangement, more than I expected." The admission startled her. It was not a declaration of love, but from this guarded man it felt significant. The warmth of his hand through her glove, the intensity in his eyes, these spoke of something evolving between them, something neither had planned for. Before she could respond, the carriage drew to a halt. The footman opened the door, and Adrian released her hand, the mask of the Duke slipping back into place. He helped her down, his touch firm at the small of her back, as he led her into the house. In the grand entrance hall he paused, turning to her. "Tomorrow we return to Ravenscroft Abbey," he said, "unless you prefer to remain in London longer." Isabella shook her head. "No, I think we've given society enough to gossip about for one evening." His lips curved faintly, almost amused. "Indeed?" Then, surprising her once more, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was a chaste gesture, but it carried more intimacy than the passionate spectacle of the ballroom. She looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. "Adrian," she whispered, summoning her courage, "that kiss at the ball, was it merely for appearances?" He stopped, his eyes unreadable, before answering simply, "No, it was not." And with that, he turned toward his study, leaving Isabella standing in the hall, her heart racing, her world spinning with questions she had never expected to ask. The countryside of Hampshire glowed with early summer light as the carriage rolled through the gates of Ravenscroft Abbey. Isabella leaned against the window, watching fields of ripening wheat sway in the breeze, the abbey's grey towers rising solemnly in the distance. The stone walls that had once seemed cold and foreign now carried a different weight, still daunting, but less hostile, as though they were slowly becoming familiar. Adrian sat across from her, as composed as ever, but his silence felt different than before. It was no longer the silence of indifference, but of contemplation, as though words pressed against his lips, restrained by habit. Life at the Abbey resumed with its accustomed rhythms, yet something had shifted between them. Though they still maintained separate chambers, Adrian no longer confined himself to his study each evening. Instead, he sometimes joined Isabella in the drawing-room or the library, where they spoke not only of estate matters but of music, books, and history. Their conversations, though cautious at first, began to wander into gentler terrain. He listened when she spoke, and occasionally, when she teased him lightly about his relentless efficiency, she glimpsed that rare flicker of a smile. These moments were not dramatic, but they carried weight, like the first cracks of sunlight after a long winter. On a warm June morning, Isabella sat in her private sitting room, reviewing correspondence regarding the household charities Adrian had entrusted to her oversight. The quiet was broken by a knock. Expecting Mrs. Henderson, she was surprised when Adrian himself entered, tall and deliberate in his movement. "I thought you might walk with me in the eastern gardens," he said without preamble. "The roses are at their peak." Isabella blinked at the unexpected invitation, then set aside her letters. "I would like that very much." They strolled along gravel paths bordered by blooming roses, their fragrance heavy in the sunlit air. Adrian spoke with unexpected knowledge of the garden's history, how his mother had commissioned certain plantings, how each Duchess of Ravenscroft had left her mark upon the grounds. "After she died," he said quietly, pausing before a particularly splendid cluster of white roses, "my father let them fall into neglect. Restoring them was one of my first acts as Duke." Isabella turned to him, struck by the rare glimpse into his past. "They are beautiful," she said sincerely. "Your mother would be proud." He gave a small, almost wistful smile. "Perhaps. She was difficult to please." His words carried no bitterness, but a quiet resignation that hinted at old wounds. Encouraged by his candour, Isabella ventured gently, "And your father?" Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. He was a traditional duke, concerned with lineage, appearances and duty, not given to warmth or approval. The simplicity of his statement belied its weight, and Isabella sensed deeper complexities he was not yet ready to share. Still, she treasured the confidence, however small. They walked on in silence until Isabella, gathering her courage, spoke of the question that had haunted her since the ball. "Adrian, what happened with Lady Caroline?" His stride faltered, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped. But then he gestured toward a stone bench nestled among the roses. "Sit," he said quietly. When they were seated, he remained silent for several moments, his gaze fixed on the distance, before he began. "Caroline Somerset was the most celebrated debutante of her season," he said evenly, though his voice carried an undercurrent of strain. "Beautiful, accomplished, from a family as proud as my own. Our marriage was hailed as the match of the decade. I was 27, newly inherited, and I believed myself in love. For a year, I thought we were happy." His eyes darkened. "Until I discovered her affair with James Blackwood." Isabella's heart tightened at the name. "Your closest friend?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Since childhood, their betrayal was not sudden. It had begun even before our wedding. I had been blind." He paused, his hands clenching lightly against his knees. The worst part was not the betrayal itself, but realizing that every tender word, every gesture had been a lie. She married me for my title, while her heart belonged elsewhere. My marriage, my friendship, both were illusions. Isabella reached for his hand instinctively, her fingers brushing his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No one deserves such cruelty." His jaw flexed, but he did not withdraw his hand. 3 months after I confronted her, she died. A riding accident. She was attempting to reach Blackwood's estate through the woodland path. The bridge was slick with rain. Her horse stumbled. His voice remained controlled, but Isabella could hear the old pain beneath. Society whispered that I had driven her to desperation, that my coldness had been the cause. Lady Winthrop especially was vocal in her judgment. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief. At last Isabella said, "Is that why you avoided remarrying?" Adrian inclined his head. "I had no desire to risk such betrayal again. I had an heir in my nephew, my brother's son. A wife seemed unnecessary." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Until your family's plight created an opportunity." The bluntness might have stung, but Isabella heard in his tone not cruelty, but honesty. "You chose me because I could not deceive you as Caroline did," she said. He looked at her then, his eyes searching. "Yes, you have never pretended to feel what you do not. That is why I trusted you with my name." Her breath caught at the admission, at the vulnerable truth beneath his measured words. For a moment, she felt the distance between them shrink. "And what do you believe I feel now?" she asked softly. His lips pressed together, his gaze troubled. "I do not know," he said at last, "and that uncertainty unsettles me. Yet I find myself wanting to discover the answer." The confession, halting though it was, marked a profound shift. Their marriage had begun as a contract, but now Adrian had laid bare the wound of his past and his tentative hope for something more. Isabella felt her heart stir in ways she had not expected when she signed her name beside his. She squeezed his hand lightly, offering comfort without pressing further. For now it was enough that he had trusted her with his truth. At that moment, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the garden's edge, her expression grave. "Your Grace," she called, addressing Adrian, "a messenger has arrived from London. Lord Hartwell has suffered a fit. He asks for his daughter." Isabella's heart lurched. "Father," she whispered, rising quickly. "How serious is it?" "The message did not say, Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson replied, "only that your presence is urgently requested." Adrian stood at once, his composure shifting into swift decisiveness. "Have the travelling carriage prepared immediately," he instructed. "Send word to Dr. Morris to meet us in London." Then, turning to Isabella, his tone softened. "Gather what you need. We depart within the hour." Tears pricked her eyes at his efficiency, his immediate acceptance of her father's plight as his own. "Thank you," she whispered. He met her gaze firmly. "He is your father," he said simply, "and now he is my family as well." The words, so plain and yet so profound, echoed in Isabella's heart as she hurried to prepare. For the first time, she felt that beneath the Duke's armour there beat not only duty, but something more, something dangerously close to devotion. The journey back to London was a blur of clattering wheels and anxious silence. Isabella sat pressed against the carriage door, her hands trembling in her lap, as she prayed for her father's survival. Adrian sat beside her, his presence steady, his arm occasionally brushing hers with quiet reassurance. Though he said little, his actions spoke volumes, ensuring she was wrapped warmly against the evening chill, calling frequent halts for the horses so she might rest, dispatching a rider ahead to prepare the townhouse for their arrival. Every gesture told her what his words did not, that her fear was his concern, her pain his burden. When at last they reached the Hartwell townhouse, Isabella hurried up the steps with Adrian close at her side. Inside, the air smelled faintly of laudanum and candle wax. Her younger sister Clara met her in the hall, her eyes swollen from tears. "Isabella!" she cried, clutching her tightly. "Father took a seizure 2 nights past. The physician says his heart is weak." Isabella steadied her sister with trembling hands. "I am here now," she whispered. "We will care for him together." Adrian exchanged a quiet word with the physician, then gently guided Isabella to her father's chamber. Lord Hartwell lay pale and frail upon the bed, his once commanding presence diminished. Isabella sank to her knees beside him, taking his thin hand in both of hers. "Father." "It is Isabella," she said softly. His eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain, yet brightening faintly at the sight of her. "My child," he whispered hoarsely. "You came." Tears slipped down Isabella's cheeks as she pressed his hand to her lips. "Of course I came." Adrian stood a respectful distance away, his face solemn, yet his gaze steady upon her, lending strength. The following days passed in a haze of vigil and care. Isabella rarely left her father's side, bathing his forehead, coaxing him to take broth, reading aloud to soothe him through the worst of his pain. Adrian remained a constant presence, never intrusive, yet always near. He managed the household with quiet authority, ensuring the physician had everything he required, calming Clara's panic, even seeing to the younger servants who feared for their positions should Lord Hartwell not recover. Isabella marvelled at his efficiency, but even more at his tenderness, for though his manner remained composed, his every action revealed a man who understood duty not as cold obligation, but as steadfast devotion. One evening, as Isabella sat by the sickbed, her father roused enough to take her hand weakly. "You have been a blessing to me, my daughter," he murmured. "I feared I had ruined you with my recklessness, yet you carry yourself now as a duchess with grace I did not deserve." Isabella's throat tightened with emotion. "You gave me life, father, and love. Nothing you did could ruin me." His gaze shifted toward Adrian, who stood watchful in the shadows. "And you, Your Grace," Lord Hartwell said with surprising strength, "you have honoured her. I thank you." Adrian inclined his head gravely. "She honours me," he replied simply. That night, after her father drifted into easier sleep, Isabella found Adrian in the townhouse library. He stood by the fire, the lamplight casting shadows across his strong features. She entered quietly, but he turned at once, as though he had been waiting for her. "How is he?" Adrian asked. "Resting," she answered softly. She hesitated, then crossed the room to stand beside him. "I do not know how I would have borne this without you." His gaze softened, the intensity tempered by something gentler. "You would have borne it, Isabella. You are stronger than you believe." She shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No, it is your strength that steadied me. You have been more than I ever expected, more than I believed possible." The silence between them grew charged, filled with the weight of unspoken words. At last, Adrian reached for her hand, his touch deliberate and sure. "When I married you," he said slowly, "I told myself it was for duty, for necessity. But that is no longer the truth. Tonight, in this house, watching you care for your father with such grace, I realized something. I no longer see this marriage as arrangement. I see it as gift." Isabella's breath caught, her heart pounding. "Adrian," she whispered. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, his voice deep and unsteady. "I cannot give you flowery declarations. That is not who I am. But I can give you honesty. I want you not merely as Duchess, but as wife, as partner, as the woman who has taught me to feel again." Her vision blurred with tears, but they were tears of joy. She raised her free hand to his cheek, marveling at the warmth of his skin, the vulnerability in his eyes. "And I want you," she said fiercely. "Not the Duke, not the title. You." For a long heartbeat, they simply gazed at one another, the firelight flickering between them. Then, with a certainty that needed no performance, Adrian lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was not fierce like the one at the ball, but deep, tender, and utterly real. Isabella melted into him, her arms winding around his shoulders as he pulled her against him. In that moment, the walls between them finally crumbled. When at last they parted, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "Come with me," he whispered. He led her not to her chamber, nor his own, but to a room newly theirs, where the consummation of their union was no longer duty, but desire. In the quiet of the night, beneath the weight of love newly born, Isabella at last understood what it meant to be both Duchess and wife. Days later, her father's health stabilized. Though weakened, he rallied enough to bless his daughter once more, his eyes alight with pride at the happiness shining between her and Adrian. And as Isabella stood at the window of her father's townhouse, Adrian's hand warm around hers, she knew that the life she had once feared, a loveless contract, a cage of duty, had transformed into something unexpected and precious. Their marriage had begun in necessity, forged in appearances, but it had become real as the steady beat of her heart in time with his.